I have made a lot of beginner-friendly coloured pencil tutorials, but what happens when you want to take that to the next level? I want to talk today about how you can improve your coloured pencil drawings, particularly as you get a bit more experienced, and kind of what you can do to level up. Now, all colour pencil drawings, no matter if they're extremely simple or much more complicated, all use the same fundamental techniques. Now, I am going to go through them very quickly in a second. If you want to go through them in a lot more detail, do first check out my beginner's tutorial. I'll leave a link in the description. Now, the most important thing that you'll need is the right kind of materials, and I'm particularly talking about the paper here. You could be an amazing artist, but if you have the wrong kind of paper, you're not going to be able to build up the colours effectively. I like drawing on something called Bristol board, which is a very smooth paper. I find that the best to build up the colour. I don't think the coloured pencils themselves matter as much. I know that you can make amazing drawings with Crayola, for example. I personally like using Polychromos and Prismacolor. Now, the main coloured pencil technique is layering. This is where you gradually build up the pencil in a series of light layers rather than just pressing really hard with the pencil. This enables the colours to mix together and gradually build up to make a richer, deeper, more blended picture. And to create all of these layers and help me choose the colours, I like using colour swatches. These are swatches that I have made showing me what each pencil in my set actually looks like on the paper. So far this has been exactly the same as with a beginner drawing. I've always used swatches, always need the right paper, and always built up with layering. The thing that is going to help take you to the next level is more layers, more colors, both choosing and selecting more colors and building more colors on top of each other, and essentially really learning to draw what you can see. So I recently drew a very lovely little cupcake. It is much more complicated than you may initially expect, and some of the things that make this much harder than a beginner drawing is particularly the white icing and all of the colors that are included in that, as well as a lot of the detail that goes into the cupcake case. So let's have a quick look at some of the things I did and some of the things I bared in mind whilst drawing this cupcake. Now, if you want to go through this drawing with me in a lot more detail, the full tutorial is available on my Patreon. In fact, I have loads of different tutorials on a huge variety of different subjects. And I have tutorials not only on coloured pencils, but also watercolour pencils and graphite. Every tutorial includes really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colours that I'll be using, sketch outlines, and the reference photo. I have some faster drawings like this, and some much longer, more impressive drawings like this. Check out the link in the description. So let's have a look at this cupcake. And actually, it all starts in a very similar way to what you would usually expect to see from me. I'm starting off by building up all of the lightest colors. So looking for the lightest color I can see in each area, which is obviously different on the raspberry to what it is on the cake and the icing. And I'm putting a really nice and light layer of each color in each section. So working through this in exactly the same way as I would before. You can see I'm holding the pencil quite far back to help me press nice and lightly, because we are going to need to build up a lot of layers here. I'm working with a really nice and sharp pencil, and I'm working in circular motions. And still very similar to how I would usually approach a drawing, I can then start working from those lightest colors towards the darker colors. So for example, on the cake itself, I can see quite a lot of a very vibrant but slightly earthy yellow. So I can add that in any area I can see a little hint of that color. And then I also want to start filling in some of the slightly darker colours on the icing. So if you really look at the icing, you will notice that it's not actually white. What we're seeing is a series of lights and darks, and also a lot of other colours in there as well, which we will look at in a short while. But the underlying colours is that there are areas of light and areas of dark. So I want to fill in those light and dark areas with this grey to just begin getting my bearings. drawings. Exactly the same on the top little section of the cupcake. I'm taking my time here to really look at the shapes that are made up within the cupcake and literally just drawing a series of shapes, drawing what I can see, but most importantly getting those lights and darks in the right places, particularly in some of these areas where I think the colours are a bit trickier. So as I say, specifically that icing and around here. And then I'm going to keep working down through the colours, so working towards those darker colours. I'm now starting from the top and working my way towards the bottom. This is a kind of orangey, earthy colour. It's called burnt ochre. There's a lot of this colour on the cake itself, and also because on the cupcake case you can see some of the cake poking through, you can see some of this colour around here as well. But as I say, so far this is very similar to what I would usually do. I'm just mapping in the colours and reasonably quickly, even though I think there is a bit more to it than usual, I have drawn in the basic shapes of a cupcake. As I say, I think there's more to it in that there's more areas to fill in. There's the raspberry, the cake. The cupcake case I do think is very complicated just because it needs to be so precise. And the icing I also think is very tricky because of the colours. But right now we're not really worrying about any of that. So I'm still working from the lighter colours towards the darker colours, exactly the same as I usually would. I think there are just more details. And at this point I'm kind of working on a template that we'll be able to build upon. And once I've filled up all of these brown areas, I think it's always important that we want to be putting colours either where we can see that colour or darker. That's going to create the richest colours within the drawing. I'm going to go back to the icing and fill in a little bit more of a darker grey, both on the icing up the top up here, and actually quite a lot of it could stand to be a lot darker. People often struggle with white areas like this. Remember, we are just drawing what we can see. And I also want to be adding some darker grey around the edge here of the cupcake case. There's a lot of different shapes along here when you really look. Finally, I can start drawing in some of the darker colours. So this is a walnut brown. This is a very dark brown. Again, looking at the shapes that I can see, I'm really just relying on, if I draw in the shapes I can see, that it will end up looking good. So the cake has a lot of kind of little patches because it's not perfectly smooth. It's got a lot of grooves in it. So let's fill all of those in. Even though it looks a little bit odd at the moment, that's okay. And then I can move on to the black pencil. I want to be quite sparing with this. I think the black can look quite harsh quite easily. So let's just build a little of it, particularly around where the icing meets the cake and around the bottom around here. So now, although I think it's been a little bit more detailed, as I've said, this has very much been the same as what we would usually do. What I think takes you that extra level is the next part, where we're going to focus on brightening up everything and really drawing what we can see. So at every moment, what I'm doing is comparing my drawing to the reference photo, thinking about the most obvious colour that's missing. So right now, the most obvious thing that's missing is the cake itself is looking a little bit odd, but also too light. And I particularly need to add some more of this kind of reddish brown. So what I've done is compared the drawing to my reference photo, also compared that to my colour swatches that I mentioned earlier, to look at the most obvious colour that's missing and the closest match that I have to that colour, and then add that in. And that is what I'm going to repeatedly do, I think, more thoroughly, and I'm going to need to do it for longer than I would normally, particularly because I think this is such a complicated drawing. So now I've added in that first colour. The most obvious difference between the drawing and my reference photo is this brown. So let's add some of this in. And then I think I'm missing a bit more of a kind of yellowy brown. So this is the raw umber. Let's add some of that in. And already the cake section is looking much better. Probably the hardest part of the drawing is the icing. And actually, when you really look at the icing, you will see some slightly hidden underlying colours. So the icing, as I said, the white isn't really white. For now, I've drawn in a series of different greys, but I don't think that's right for it either. And actually, in a lot of areas on the icing, particularly towards the left-hand side, side, it has a lot of pink to it, a surprising amount of pink to it. And I think part of what needs to be learned is how to look at the reference photo and start to try and spot these missing colors. Now, if you're struggling, you could take a photo, the reference photo, and increase the saturation, and that gives a good idea. You can see how much pink there is, and also some yellow that we'll add in a short while. So that already looks better. Interestingly, adding pink to the white section doesn't make the white section look pink. It just makes it have a little bit more life. So let's think about adding some of that earthy yellow we added earlier to start with on the cupcake. But also, as I mentioned, there's actually a lot of this yellow within the icing. So let's build that up. Again, it works, even though you wouldn't expect to be able to put bright yellow on the white and for it to still look white. It does. It looks like reflections. And in fact, I find the more colors that I add, the more obvious it is what's missing. So comparing my drawing to the reference photo and the color swatches now, there is in the pink areas, it's actually a bit more of a kind of pinky purple. So I've got a pencil called Red Violet, which is still, if you use it lightly, a pink tone, but as I say, it does have that little bit of blue to it. And I can see a lot of that on the left hand side, but also a lot of it around the top of the cupcake. And you can see that we're gradually getting so much richer. The whole drawing is bit by bit looking more interesting. So let's add in more pink. And then I want to be making the grays look darker. Now, if you ever get stuck between knowing, particularly on a white area like this, where you need to add more general shading, kind of what I'm doing here, it sometimes helps to take your drawing, take a photo of your drawing on your phone and turn it into black and white. And that will show you where you need to make areas darker if you do that to your drawing and to the reference photo. So you can see hopefully a bit clearer where you need to add in those darker areas. And then I can go in with a darker color and really build that up. I always think the key to a realistic looking drawing is more than anything contrast, but also getting a really nice vibrancy of color. So as I get into the final tweaks, I'm still comparing my drawing to that reference photo to think about the most obvious colors that are missing. I think it might be interesting to take a look at the number of pencils that it took to draw this picture. So look at all of these pencils. Usually I would say I use about 10 for a standard beginner drawing, or maybe even less. But because I needed to build up so much vibrancy in this drawing, I did have to use a little bit more. Now, I hope that kind of gives you some inspiration, a little bit of idea of what you can do to take your drawing to the next level. I think it is in part picking maybe a slightly different and maybe more complicated reference photo, like by drawing something white like this icing, but also learning to see those underlying colors. Just keep building up with maybe more layers than you would have done to begin with, and you'll end up with a much more interesting drawing. Now, don't forget, if you do want to draw this with me in a lot more detail, it is available on my Patreon. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.